During World War II, the Eastern Front became the stage for a conflict of unprecedented scale and brutality. The clash between Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union from 1941 to 1945 ranks among the bloodiest chapters in human history. On the Eastern Front alone, it is estimated that more than 30 million soldiers and civilians perished. By comparison, the Western Allies, Britain and the United States, lost fewer than 1 million lives combined. Traditional rules of warfare ceased to exist here, and human life lost all value. While on the Western Front, armies still partially followed the Geneva Conventions. In the East, the war was one of annihilation, an ideological struggle in which each side dehumanized the other and openly planned the extermination of tens of millions of people. Hitler ordered his generals not to take prisoners during the campaign in the East and to show no mercy to civilians. Stalin, on the contrary, called upon his people to fight to the last drop of blood. There was no room for compromise or compassion. During the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union and the following 4 years of battle, unimaginable atrocities occurred. The front line surged back and forth across all of Eastern Europe. In 1941, the Wehrmacht advanced from the Polish border to the gates of Moscow. 3 years later, the Red Army pushed from Stalingrad to Berlin. Fighting stretched across vast territories and on a scale never before seen. At one point, the Eastern Front extended over 2,000 kilometers, from the Arctic coast to the Caucasus Mountains. In public memory, the image of the Western Front still dominates. D-Day in Normandy, the Battle of Britain, the liberation of Paris. Yet the true epicenter of suffering lay far to the east, in the endless steppes and ruined cities from the Baltic to the Caucasus. The Eastern Front was far more brutal than most people can even imagine. And that is what this story reveals. In this narrative, you will learn why the struggle between Nazis and Soviets became so merciless, and what concrete forms this brutality took. We will expose the shocking fates of Soviet POWs, whom the Germans deliberately left to die of hunger and cold. We will enter besieged cities where desperate civilians resorted to cannibalism to survive. We will witness entire villages erased from the map under the banner of Nazi reprisals. You will see how what began as a conventional war turned into a competition of atrocities, each month bringing a new and even darker chapter. From mass shootings of civilians to acts of total destruction as the conflict neared its end. We will not simply list numbers and statistics. Instead, we rely on documentary evidence, soldiers' diaries, generals' reports, and the memoirs of surviving civilians to portray the reality of the Eastern Front as truthfully as possible. Prepare for an emotional and chilling journey into history, a story filled with horror, but one that must be remembered to understand how far blind hatred and aggression can go, and what lessons we can draw from it for today's world. Let us enter the world of the Eastern Front, where World War II descended into apocalypse. Even before the first shot was fired, it was clear that the war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union would not be a conventional conflict. Adolf Hitler conceived the campaign from the start as an existential struggle to the death. In his speeches and orders, he depicted Soviet citizens, Russians, Ukrainians, and other Slavic peoples as an inferior race, to be exterminated or enslaved. Nazi ideology defined the war in the East as a clash between civilization and Judeo-Bolshevik hordes. Shortly before the invasion of the USSR, the German High Command issued the so-called Special Directives for Operation Barbarossa. These orders effectively suspended all obligations under international law on occupied territories. In other words, German soldiers were given free rein in dealing with civilians and prisoners of war. No punishment awaited them for crimes committed in the East. Among these criminal orders, as historians later called them, was the infamous Commissar Order. It instructed troops to identify and execute on the spot any political commissar, that is, any communist officer of the Red Army, captured in battle. Other directives demanded the extermination of partisans, Jews, communists, and so-called unreliable elements. The Nazis planned to transform the conquered East into a colony for Aryans. The detailed General Plan Ost envisioned that tens of millions of Slavs would either perish or be deported beyond the Urals to make room for German settlers. These horrific schemes were not mere theory. They shaped the behavior of ordinary German troops. From the very first months of the campaign, Wehrmacht soldiers were indoctrinated through political training to view the war as a racial crusade, a campaign to exterminate subhumans. One German general declared that sympathy for civilians in the East was an undesirable weakness. As a result, many regular officers tolerated or directly organized atrocities that would have been unthinkable on the Western Front. The Soviet side, meanwhile, also displayed extreme ideological zeal and brutality, though for different reasons. Stalin's regime prepared for a mortal struggle and had already demonstrated its ruthlessness in the 1930s, during the Holodomor famine in Ukraine, when millions starved, and through the terror of the NKVD, which kept the population in constant fear. When Hitler struck in June 1941, the Kremlin proclaimed the Great Patriotic War, a fight to the death for national survival. Soviet propaganda portrayed Germans as beasts and bloodthirsty murderers, fueling soldiers' determination to take no prisoners and to avenge the enemy in kind. Stalin's policies were brutal even toward his own people. In the first weeks of the invasion, he ordered the scorched earth strategy. Retreating units destroyed food supplies, infrastructure, and entire villages to leave nothing for the invader, condemning their own civilians to starvation. Simultaneously, the NKVD received instructions to execute thousands of political prisoners in territories about to fall to the enemy and to shoot deserters or panic-stricken soldiers in their own ranks. Thus, Red Army troops fought knowing that retreat or capture could mean death, either at Nazi hands or by their own. Soviet leadership considered any surrender an act of treason. Later, Order Number 227, not one step back, merely codified what was already practiced. Anyone retreating without orders would be shot on sight. Even this handful of facts shows that on the Eastern Front, a conflict was brewing beyond all conceivable norms of war. When in the summer of 1941 the Nazis invaded Soviet territory, both sides, driven by inhuman ideology and freed from restraint, unleashed a hell the world had never seen before. On June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched his meticulously prepared invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. More than 3.5 million German and Allied soldiers crossed the borders that morning, advancing with lightning speed. Within days, the Red Army's defenses collapsed. Entire Soviet armies were encircled, and German troops penetrated hundreds of kilometers deep into Soviet territory. But this astonishing blitzkrieg was accompanied by a systematic bloodbath. From the very beginning, mass killings of civilians began, especially Jews, communists, and anyone considered undesirable. Behind the advancing Wehrmacht came special SS units called Einsatzgruppen, whose sole mission was to identify and eliminate hostile populations. Villages and towns on the conquered lands were burned to the ground, their inhabitants buried in mass graves. One of the most infamous early massacres occurred at Babi Yar, near Kiev, at the end of September 1941. Over the course of 2 days, German forces murdered more than 33,000 Jews, men, women, and children, making it one of the largest single mass killings of the Holocaust. Hundreds of similar tragedies unfolded across Ukraine and Belarus. Local collaborators sometimes joined the killings. In other cases, they merely stood by. The terror spread with breathtaking speed. As SS units executed civilians in the rear, the Wehrmacht continued its advance, capturing millions of Red Army soldiers. During the summer and autumn of 1941 alone, an incredible 3 to 4 million Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner. But for most of them, captivity meant not survival, but a slow death. The Nazis refused to follow the Geneva Conventions on the treatment of prisoners of war. The Soviet Union had not signed those agreements either, so the Germans felt free to ignore them completely. Official German documents explicitly stated that POWs unable to work should be starved to death. Improvised open-air camps offered no food, water, or medical aid. Thousands of men were herded behind barbed wire on empty fields. No barracks, no sanitation, nothing. They received either minimal rations or none at all. Deprivation reached such extremes that survivors later recalled prisoners eating grass, leaves, and even resorting to cannibalism. When the first winter frosts came, death swept through the camps. Emaciated men froze to death in their sleep. In a single camp near Minsk, 100,000 Soviet POWs died within a few months. Some prisoners, in utter despair, begged to be shot rather than left to die of hunger and cold. Every day in the autumn of 1941, tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers perished in German captivity, more in a single day than all British and American POW deaths in the entire war combined. In total, around 3 million Red Army soldiers died in German captivity, most of them within the first year of the conflict. This monstrous loss remains one of the greatest war crimes of the Nazi regime. Even before the Holocaust reached its peak, the civilian population of the Soviet Union was suffering on a similarly catastrophic scale. In the occupied territories, the German army behaved with absolute ruthlessness, seizing food, livestock, and winter supplies, leaving nothing for the locals. Combined with the Soviet scorched earth policy, which had already destroyed what little remained, hundreds of thousands of civilians in the occupied regions began to starve. By the winter of 1941-42, famine had erupted across Ukraine and southern Russia, wiping out entire families. The Nazis had planned this cynically. Their logistics prioritized feeding German troops. They calculated that cities like Kharkov and Kyiv would simply starve to death. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died of hunger or diseases caused by malnutrition. But the most terrifying tragedy was still unfolding in the north, in Leningrad, where Hitler's forces decided to starve an entire city into submission. The winter of 1941 arrived, and in the besieged city of Leningrad, people's blood and bones began to freeze. Fuel and food stocks had been exhausted. 16-year-old Vladimir Dan later recalled how he and his mother first broke apart their kitchen table and cupboards for firewood. When the last pieces of furniture burned, they turned to their family library, feeding the stove with volumes of Goethe, Shakespeare, Pushkin, and Tolstoy. Each book gave only a few minutes of warmth. That was the desperate reality of a city condemned to a slow death. The siege of Leningrad began in September 1941, when German forces, assisted by the Finnish army from the north, encircled the city and cut off all land routes. Hitler announced that Leningrad, the second largest Soviet city with 2 million inhabitants, would not be stormed but starved into extinction. German planners even calculated how long it would take for the population to consume its food reserves and turn to cannibalism. Nazi propaganda cynically predicted that the fall of what they mockingly called Budapest would be only a matter of weeks. But Leningrad did not surrender. Instead began 872 days of siege, during which hunger, cold, and shelling became daily reality for hundreds of thousands. By the winter of 1941-42, food rations dropped to absurdly small portions. Workers received 250 grams of bread per day, while ordinary citizens got only 125 grams, a thin slice, smaller than a human palm. Even worse, this bread consisted mostly of sawdust and substitutes, as flour had long run out. People ate literally anything that could sustain life. Historical records and survivors' diaries describe menus that included wallpaper paste, boiled leather belts, and shoe soles, cooked into a gelatinous broth to extract traces of nutrients. Animals and even pests, pigeons, cats, dogs, rats, were hunted to extinction. Vaseline, ointments, and even lipstick were eaten as food because they contained fats. Desperate workers boiled machine oil at factories to collect a few drops of grease. Women fried pancakes from cosmetic powders, and men scraped the last crystals of sugar from burned factories. Eventually, cannibalism became widespread. At first it existed in silence, but soon it became so common that the city police created a special department to combat cannibalism. According to official archives, 260 people were convicted for it. Unofficially, the number was much higher. Parents feared letting their children outside, afraid they would be kidnapped and killed for meat. Yet despite everything, Leningrad did not fall. Even in the darkest days, bakeries, hospitals, and radio stations continued to operate. Music and news broadcasts tried to keep people's morale alive. The composer Dmitri Shostakovich wrote his famous Leningrad Symphony during the siege. When it was performed in August 1942, musicians were collapsing from exhaustion, and the audience consisted mostly of soldiers. But the concert became a symbol of unbreakable spirit. The reality, however, remained brutal. Every day, 3,000 to 4,000 people died on the streets. The dead lay on sidewalks because the living lacked the strength to bury them. By the spring of 1942, around 400,000 civilians had died of starvation and cold, and with each passing month, tens of thousands more perished. People died in unheated apartments, at factory machines, or on their way to fetch water. Those who survived were skeletal, swollen from hunger, and barely able to walk. In total, during the siege of Leningrad, between 800,000 and 1.2 million civilians died. No one knows the exact number. For comparison, that is 10 times more deaths than those caused by the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. Almost every Leningrad family lost several members, and still, the city never surrendered. Finally, in January 1944, after more than 2 years of siege, the Red Army broke the blockade, saving about 700,000 survivors, emaciated, frostbitten, but alive. Leningrad became a symbol of human endurance, and also a monument to the limitless cruelty of war, where the annihilation of an entire city became a deliberate weapon. After the siege ended, the world learned of the horrors endured there. But while Leningrad was starving in the north, in the south a different inferno was taking shape. The coming Battle of Stalingrad, one of the bloodiest engagements in human history. While the north starved in Leningrad, in the south, another cataclysm was forming. Stalingrad, the city on the Volga that bore the Soviet leader's name, became the target of a new German offensive in the summer of 1942. Hitler sought to deliver a decisive blow by seizing this industrial center and cutting off Soviet access to the vital Volga River. In August 1942, the first German units reached the outskirts of the city. Soon after, the Luftwaffe began a relentless bombing campaign that turned Stalingrad into burning ruins. Within days, tens of thousands of civilians were killed. Stalin refused to authorize evacuation, trapping hundreds of thousands of residents inside. Before the battle, Stalingrad had a population of over 500,000 civilians. By the spring of 1943, only a handful were still alive. Records show just around 1,500 survivors among the ruins. The destruction of Stalingrad created the stage for one of the most brutal urban battles in history. Two armies locked in combat amidst the rubble, unleashing a living hell. The Soviet 62nd Army, under General Vasily Chuekov, dug into the ruins and refused to retreat even a single meter. Stalin's order was clear: defend the city at all costs. The infamous directive, "not a step back," was enforced literally. NKVD troops stood behind the front lines, shooting any soldier who attempted to flee across the Volga. On the other side, Hitler raged that Stalingrad must be taken at all costs. German divisions were ordered to fight to the last man. As a result, prisoners were rare. Most battles ended in death for one side or the other. The front line ran not just through streets, but through individual buildings and even floors. Soldiers fought for every wall, every basement, every room. A German officer wrote home, "The entire campaign in France lasted less time than the battle for a single factory on the Volga." Another diary read, "The streets are measured not in meters, but in corpses. Stalingrad is no longer a city. By day it is a vast cloud of smoke and fire. By night, a blazing inferno from which even dogs try to swim across the Volga to escape. Buildings crumbled under artillery fire. The ground was littered with bodies, and still the fighting went on. Both sides threw everything they had into the inferno. The Germans sent tanks and flamethrowers into the ruins. The Luftwaffe continued to bomb what was already rubble, while Soviet forces used snipers hidden in debris and launched ferocious night counterattacks. One famous site became known as Pavlov's House, defended by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov's unit for nearly 2 months against constant assaults. After the war, it was said that more Germans died trying to capture Pavlov's house than during the entire occupation of Paris. The soldiers on both sides reached the limits of human endurance. Newly drafted Soviet recruits often survived only a few hours or days at the front before being killed. German divisions, too, lost most of their experienced men within weeks, replaced by exhausted replacements for whom Stalingrad became a grave. Both sides struggled to maintain supply lines. The Soviets ferried everything across the Volga River under enemy fire, while German logistics were overstretched and collapsing. Hunger and thirst tormented the soldiers as much as the fighting itself. By November 1942, the Red Army launched its great counteroffensive, Operation Uranus. Soviet forces encircled the entire German 6th Army, about 300,000 men. The hunters had become the hunted. Inside the ruined city, the Germans were trapped, short of food, fuel, and ammunition. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, commander of the 6th Army, repeatedly begged Hitler for permission to break out. The answer was always the same: hold your ground. The agony of the encircled troops began. Attempts to resupply them by air failed miserably. The Luftwaffe could deliver only a fraction of what was needed. Soldiers slaughtered and ate their horses, and when the animals were gone, they resorted to boiling leather and glue, just as people had done in Leningrad. Diseases like typhus and dysentery ravaged the trenches and cellars. Wounded men died without medicine. Amputations were performed with saws, without anesthesia. Yet Hitler continued to forbid surrender. By late January 1943, the German situation was hopeless. Starving, frozen, and demoralized, the remnants of the 6th Army could no longer fight. On February 2, 1943, Paulus and his surviving troops finally surrendered. Out of 90,000 emaciated prisoners, only about 5,000 lived to see the end of the war. The rest perished from starvation, disease, or in Soviet labor camps in the years that followed. The Battle of Stalingrad cost unimaginable losses on both sides. The Soviets lost over 1 million men, including around 250,000 killed and the rest wounded or sick. The Axis forces, Germans, Italians, Romanians, and Hungarians, lost a similar number, with over 800,000 dead, wounded, or captured. In total, Stalingrad consumed between 1.5 and 2 million lives. It became not only the turning point of the war, but also a symbol of absolute brutality. Survivors described it simply as hell on earth. No other battle illustrated so vividly that, on the Eastern Front, there was no such thing as an honorable war, only the senseless slaughter of human beings. After Stalingrad, the Red Army began its relentless push westward, and the Germans turned to defense. But the brutality did not diminish. It merely changed form. Behind the main battle lines, another darker conflict was now raging: the partisan war. As the front lines shifted west after Stalingrad, another kind of war erupted behind them, a hidden and savage struggle that consumed entire regions. In the forests and swamps of occupied territories, thousands of determined men and women, soldiers cut off from their units, peasants, and communist activists, formed the partisan movement. These guerrillas sabotaged railways, ambushed German supply columns, and executed local collaborators. They became the enemy that the Nazis could never fully control. In Belarus, Ukraine, and Western Russia, an invisible front emerged, one that forced the Germans to divert a large share of their forces just to fight it. The Nazi response was cold and systematic terror. To suppress resistance, the occupiers deployed special anti-partisan units, often composed of the worst elements of society. Among them was the notorious SS Dirlewanger Brigade, made up of convicted criminals and sadists. These units were given complete freedom to act, and in practice they waged war not only against partisans, but against entire civilian populations suspected of supporting them. The captured partisans faced horrific fates. One of the most famous was Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, an 18-year-old Soviet girl caught while trying to burn German stables near Moscow. She was tortured and publicly hanged. Her story became a symbol of both heroism and suffering in the Soviet Union. Such tragedies were countless. German directives explicitly ordered collective reprisals. For every partisan attack, local civilians were to be punished, as an example. In practice, this meant that entire villages were burned and their inhabitants massacred. In occupied Serbia, the Nazis imposed a fixed ratio: 100 civilians shot for every German killed, 50 for every wounded. Similar brutal arithmetic was applied throughout the East. Large parts of Belarus, Ukraine, and Western Russia experienced what can only be described as the genocide of the rural population under the pretext of anti-partisan warfare. Every Czech knows the tragedy of Lidis or Ležáky, small villages wiped out by the Nazis. Now imagine not 2, but 5,000 Lidices. That is roughly how many Belarusian, Ukrainian, and Russian villages were erased from the map, their people slaughtered. In Belarus alone, the occupiers burned 5,295 villages and murdered about 2 million people, nearly a quarter of the country's entire population. Some areas were completely depopulated. In the Vitebsk region, villages like Katyn were destroyed multiple times. In March 1943, the Nazis herded all of Katyn's inhabitants into a barn and burned them alive as punishment for a partisan attack. Among the 149 victims were dozens of children. Similar horrors occurred in thousands of other settlements. Eyewitnesses later described landscapes of charred ruins and corpses, with livestock slaughtered, wells poisoned, and fields reduced to ash. Under the banner of fighting partisans, the Germans turned swaths of Eastern Europe into wastelands of death. Hostages were executed on suspicion alone. Men, women, and children were lined up and shot simply because someone believed they had fed a partisan. Torture and public hangings became tools of intimidation. In one village, the Nazis forced residents to watch the execution of their mayor as a lesson. Women were raped and deported for forced labor in the Reich. Homes were looted and burned. Hundreds of thousands of young people were seized and sent to Germany as Ostarbeiters, slave laborers for German factories and farms. Many died of exhaustion, hunger, or Allied bombings. The partisan war, however, was brutal on both sides. Partisans themselves sometimes acted mercilessly, killing collaborators, German officials, and soldiers without trial, often with gruesome inventiveness. In retaliation for Nazi terror, they took no prisoners, and captured Germans could expect no mercy. This underground conflict gradually descended into barbarism. Executions of prisoners, torture of suspects, and widespread chaos became routine, with ordinary villagers suffering the most, caught between the two fires. Ethnic tensions also flared under occupation. In western Ukraine in 1943, nationalist insurgents massacred tens of thousands of Polish civilians in what became known as the Volhynian Massacre. Thus, the Eastern Front was not only a battlefield of armies, but also a civil war and genocide among ethnic groups, ignited and exploited by Nazi policies of divide and rule, By 1944, as the Red Army advanced westward, vast regions of Eastern Europe lay in ruins. Railways were blown up, cities and villages burned, and entire areas left without men. They had either joined the partisans, been deported, or killed. In Ukraine and Belarus, after the war, only women, children, and the elderly remained. The male population had been annihilated. This hidden war within the war revealed the total collapse of humanity on the Eastern Front. No conventions, no rules, only brutality and collective revenge. By the spring of 1944, the Red Army had finally liberated the last corner of Soviet soil from Nazi occupation. Millions of people in Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia returned to their homes, or rather, to what was left of them: ruins, ashes, and silence. Survivors had endured unimaginable suffering, but the worst occupation in history was over. Yet for the German soldiers retreating westward, new horrors began. Those who were captured saw firsthand the atrocities their own army had inflicted, and many now feared the vengeance that was approaching. The Soviet soldiers marching toward Germany had seen their villages burned, their families slaughtered. Now they were coming to settle the score. When the Red Army crossed its borders in 1944 and advanced into Central Europe, it brought not only liberation from Nazism, but also a storm of retribution. Before them lay Nazi-occupied Poland, and beyond it, Germany itself. The troops who had survived years of hell on the Eastern Front carried with them deep rage and hatred, fueled by years of propaganda calling for vengeance. Soviet newspapers and speeches fanned the fire. Articles and posters declared, "Kill the Germans, don't spare them." The famous Soviet writer Ilya Ehrenburg urged soldiers to show no mercy, to make the enemy feel the pain they had inflicted. These calls for vengeance created the psychological groundwork for what followed, a dark chapter in the otherwise victorious campaign. By late 1944, when Soviet troops entered East Prussia, reports of atrocities began to spread. In October 1944, Red Army soldiers captured the village of Nemmersdorf. According to German sources, dozens of civilians, including women and children, were killed, and many were found mutilated. The Nazi propaganda machine immediately broadcast the incident across Germany, igniting mass panic among civilians in the East. Millions began fleeing westward in chaotic columns, often in freezing conditions. Refugee convoys clogged the roads, attacked from the air, and caught in the chaos of retreat. But flight did not always bring safety. There were numerous cases of Soviet soldiers attacking or executing refugees, their rage blinding them to the distinction between enemy and civilian. One of the most tragic symbols of this period was the Wilhelm Gustloff disaster. In January 1945, over 10,000 German refugees, mostly women and children, boarded the ship to escape East Prussia. A Soviet submarine torpedoed it in the Baltic Sea, killing over 9,000 people. The deadliest maritime disaster in history. But the most widespread acts of revenge were not on the seas. They were in the cities and villages that fell under Soviet control. As Red Army units entered Germany, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, many soldiers gave in to rage, alcohol, and despair. Looting and mass sexual violence became common. German women and girls faced a wave of systematic rape on a scale never seen before in Europe. Eyewitness accounts describe victims ranging from 8-year-old girls to 80-year-old women. Some were raped by groups of soldiers, one after another. Others were tortured or killed afterward. The medical system had collapsed, leaving the victims without help. Many women suffered lifelong trauma, diseases, or took their own lives. Historians estimate that in Germany and the occupied territories, including East Prussia, Silesia, and the Kaliningrad region, hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, of women were raped. Commanders of the Red Army, including Marshals Zhukov and Konev, issued strict orders to stop looting and violence, but these orders were often ignored. In some cases, officers intervened with extreme measures, There are documented instances of commanders executing their own soldiers, caught committing rape or murder. Yet overall, discipline broke down under the weight of revenge and chaos. Beyond individual violence, collective punishment took shape. Stalin sought retribution not only against Germans, but also against entire ethnic groups he deemed disloyal. In May 1944, shortly after the liberation of Crimea, he ordered the mass deportation of the Crimean Tatars. More than 200,000 people were forced into cattle trains and exiled to Central Asia. During the journey and the first years of exile, nearly half of them died from starvation and disease. The same fate befell the Chechens, Ingush, Kalmyks, and other minorities, accused of collaboration with the enemy. These acts of collective guilt became some of the darkest decisions of the Soviet government during the war. Many of those deported were allowed to return home only decades later. Some never did. German prisoners of war also faced grim destinies. Those who survived the battles were sent to Soviet labor camps, where conditions resembled those once endured by Soviet POWs under the Nazis. Starvation, forced labor, and cold killed about 1/3 of the 3 million German soldiers captured on the Eastern Front. Many were used to rebuild destroyed Soviet cities and factories. The last of them returned home only in 1955, 10 years after the war's end. When the Red Army captured Berlin in May 1945, the war in Europe was over. But what it left behind was a world both liberated and shattered, a victory shadowed by the moral collapse that accompanied revenge. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the scale of destruction on the Eastern Front defied comprehension. The human, material, and moral losses were so vast that they reshaped the very fabric of Europe. The Soviet Union bore the brunt of the suffering. According to post-war estimates, it lost between 26 and 27 million people, an unimaginable toll. Of these, 8 to 11 million were soldiers of the Red Army, while 15 to 17 million were civilians, men, women, and children, who perished from massacres, starvation, disease, and exhaustion. This means that roughly 1 in every 8 Soviet citizens was killed. By comparison, the United States lost about 400,000 soldiers, mostly on other fronts, and Britain around 370,000. Poland, at the center of the Nazi Generalplan Ost, suffered the most after the USSR, about 6 million dead, or 17% of its entire population, more than half of whom were Polish Jews murdered in the Holocaust. Belarus lost a quarter of its people, and Ukraine counted at least 7 million dead. Even Germany, the aggressor, paid a horrifying price. Between 5 and 7 million Germans died, including 4.5 million soldiers, the majority on the Eastern Front, and up to 1.5 million civilians, who perished in Allied bombings, the final battles, and post-war expulsions. Hundreds of thousands more were lost among Romanian, Hungarian, Italian, Czech, Yugoslav, and other troops drawn into the conflict. In total, roughly 2/3 of all military deaths in World War II occurred on the Eastern Front. Most civilian casualties as well. This was, in every sense, a war of total annihilation. Of every 10 German soldiers killed during the entire war, 8 died in the East. And the Holocaust itself unfolded largely within the territory of the Eastern Front. Hundreds of thousands of Jews murdered by Einsatzgruppen in the Baltic states, Ukraine, and Belarus, and millions more in death camps such as Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec, all built on occupied Polish soil. The material devastation was equally catastrophic. The Soviet Union lost an enormous portion of its industrial base and infrastructure. According to post-war reports, the occupiers had completely destroyed 1,610 cities and around 70,000 villages. More than 32,000 factories and 65,000 kilometers of railway were blown up or dismantled. Countless bridges, schools, hospitals, and cultural monuments were gone. Entire cities, Minsk, Kyiv, Smolensk, Volgograd, Stalingrad, lay in ruins by 1945. About 25 million people in the USSR were left homeless. Agriculture was in shambles. Once fertile fields had become battlefields littered with mines and corpses, and millions of hectares stood barren. A new wave of famine followed. In 1946-47, hundreds of thousands more died of hunger in post-war Ukraine and Russia. Eastern Europe needed decades to recover from this devastation. The demographic consequences were profound. By 1945, there were only about 70 men for every 100 women in the Soviet Union. An entire generation of young men had vanished. Millions of families were left without fathers and sons. Across Europe, refugees and displaced persons wandered the ruins. Freed prisoners, forced laborers, orphans, and POWs. Many discovered that their homes no longer existed. Repatriation and resettlement took years, and for some, never truly ended. The suffering cannot be measured in numbers alone. Tens of millions were left physically and mentally scarred. The continent was filled with disabled veterans, amputees, and civilians maimed or blinded by war. But even more bore invisible wounds. Widows, orphans, raped women, and survivors of camps who carried trauma no one could comprehend. In the Soviet Union, the war became known as the Great Patriotic War, a sacred term that still echoes today. Every family had lost someone. The dead were remembered as martyrs and heroes. Across the country, eternal flames and monuments rose from the rubble, ensuring that the sacrifice would never be forgotten. Even today, the earth continues to reveal its buried evidence. Unexploded bombs, old mines, and mass graves still uncovered decades later, silent witnesses to the horror that once consumed half the world. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, the victors faced a new question: how to judge the unimaginable crimes that had taken place on the Eastern Front. For the first time in history, humanity attempted to hold an entire regime legally accountable for its atrocities. In 1946, the world's attention turned to Nuremberg, where leading Nazi officials were tried for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes of aggression. The Nuremberg trials revealed to the world the true scale of the Holocaust, the mass murders in the East, and the systematic extermination of prisoners and civilians. Documents and eyewitness accounts described the deliberate starvation of millions of Soviet POWs, the destruction of villages, and the liquidation of entire ethnic groups. For many Western observers, it was the first time they grasped the full horror of the Eastern Front. Several high-ranking Nazi commanders were sentenced to death. Others received long prison terms, yet many perpetrators escaped justice or received lenient sentences. Thousands of lower-ranking officers and collaborators melted back into civilian life, blending into post-war Germany and Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union, while presenting itself as a liberator, did not allow discussion of its own crimes. The massacre of Polish officers in Katyn Forest in 1940, committed by the NKVD, was falsely blamed on the Germans for decades. Only after 1990 did Moscow officially admit responsibility. Topics such as the mass rapes in Germany or the deportation of entire nations, the Crimean Tatars, Chechens, and others, were taboo in the Soviet era. The official narrative focused exclusively on heroism and sacrifice, painting the Red Army as morally flawless. Meanwhile, in Western Europe and the United States, public attention remained fixated on the Western Front. Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, and the liberation of concentration camps. For years, the bloody reality of the Eastern Front was little known in the West, its stories buried under the new divide that soon emerged: the Cold War. The ideological chasm between the Soviet bloc and the Western Allies froze cooperation and distorted historical memory. The USSR emerged as a superpower, claiming moral legitimacy through its colossal wartime sacrifice. But this victory also gave Stalin justification to impose Soviet control over Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and East Germany, transforming them into satellite states under communist rule. The West, wary of Soviet expansion, responded with containment and rearmament. The result was the Iron Curtain, descending across Europe from the Baltic to the Adriatic. Behind it lay not only political division, but also two competing memories of the war. In the East, the war was mythologized as a sacred crusade against fascism. In the West, it was remembered as a victory of democracy and freedom. Between these narratives, the nuanced truth, the unimaginable suffering of the Eastern Front, was often overshadowed or simplified. Nevertheless, the Eastern Front shaped the post-war world in every conceivable way. The devastation justified Stalin's harsh control over his sphere of influence, while Western nations used the Nazi threat to reinforce their own alliances, eventually leading to NATO and the long geopolitical standoff that defined the 20th century. Even in peace, the shadow of the war lingered. Entire generations grew up among ruins, with trauma buried deep under patriotic slogans. The true stories of mass executions, starvation, deportations, and revenge remained largely untold until the archives began to open in the late 20th century. By then, the soldiers who had fought and the civilians who had suffered were old, their memories fading. But their testimonies, diaries, and letters remain, raw, painful, and essential reminders of what humans are capable of when ideology and hatred consume reason. The Eastern Front of World War II remains the greatest human tragedy of the 20th century. Its echoes still shape Europe's demography, politics, and collective memory. The destruction it unleashed was so total that even 80 years later, the land, the people, and the nations still carry its scars. The story of the Eastern Front is more than a chronicle of battles and bloodshed. It is a warning. It reveals how hatred, ideology, and dehumanization can transform ordinary men into monsters and entire societies into instruments of extermination. Tens of millions died not because of natural disaster, but because of deliberate human choice. After the war, the world swore never again. Statesmen sought reconciliation instead of revenge. In 1970, German Chancellor Willy Brandt knelt before the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial, silently asking forgiveness from the Polish people, a gesture that became one of the most powerful symbols of post-war humility. Out of the ruins, new institutions were born. The United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the Geneva Conventions on the protection of civilians and prisoners. They were all shaped by the memory of what had happened between 1941 and 1945 on the Eastern Front. And yet, peace and civilization can never be taken for granted. Even today, decades later, wars once again rage in Europe. Propaganda once again dehumanizes the enemy, and echoes of 1941 return with chilling familiarity. That is why remembering the Eastern Front is not an act of nostalgia. It is an act of moral vigilance. Across the former Soviet Union, Victory Day is still celebrated each year. For families in Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland, the war remains a living memory. Grandparents tell of hunger and cold, of sieges and death, of brothers who never returned. Photo albums preserve the faces of soldiers, while town squares hold tanks on pedestals and monuments engraved with endless lists of names. This collective remembrance shapes national identity, sometimes as a source of pride and sacrifice, sometimes as a tool of political manipulation. That is why honest history is vital, not to glorify or demonize, but to understand. The truth of the Eastern Front is complex and painful, but only truth can teach. Art and literature have carried that truth forward. The Soviet film Come and See, 1985, captured the burning of a Belarusian village through the eyes of a child, creating one of the most harrowing anti-war works ever made. The writer Vasily Grossman, in his novel Life and Fate, portrayed the Battle of Stalingrad with unmatched authenticity and compassion. These works remind us that memory is not just about dates, it is about people. And what, finally, is the lesson for us? That peace, freedom, and human life are the most precious things we possess. The war on the Eastern Front showed that once the spiral of hatred begins, ordinary people can become both victims and perpetrators of unimaginable crimes. No one in 1941 could have imagined Babi Yar, Stalingrad, or Auschwitz. Yet they happened. Our civilization has advanced since then. We have global institutions, better communication, and universal laws. But all it takes is apathy and fear to let darkness rise again. That is why tolerance, empathy, and historical truth must be cultivated, generation after generation. We have spoken today of horrors that chill the blood, not to shock, but to honor the memory of those who died, and to remind ourselves never to descend so low again. When we travel through modern Europe, past green fields, rebuilt cities, and peaceful villages, it seems almost impossible to believe that just a few generations ago, they were wastelands of ashes and corpses. Yet from that devastation, peace grew. Former enemies became neighbors and partners. That may be the greatest paradox, and the greatest hope, of that terrible war, that even after the darkest night, the sun can rise again. Our duty is to remember those who never saw that dawn, and to do everything possible to ensure that such a catastrophe never happens again. Thank you for walking through this difficult history until the end. If this story moved you, share it, speak of it, and keep the memory alive, because remembrance is the foundation of peace.